What I find, Alex, interesting here is it's one of Aquinas' implicit arguments for God's existence. So the famous ones based on cosmology, but there's one based upon final causality. So here you are right now in your room or your studio, and you're doing the show. So the first question, well, why? Why are you doing it? And you give an answer of some kind, like, well, because this is my livelihood. Well, why is that your livelihood? Well, because I want to make money. Well, why do you want to make money? Well, for this end or that end. Well, why do you think those ends are important? That with any concrete moral act, the two of us are committing a moral act right now, right? We've chosen to do something we both think is good. Well, how come? Keep asking the why question over and over and over again. You'll come finally to some uncaused cause of the will, some summum bonum. Now, I'd call that God for all sorts of reasons we can get into. But let's say it's money, success, it's fame, it's power, it's whatever. But willy-nilly, everyone's got a summum bonum. That's why the Bible would say the choice is not between theism and atheism. It's always between right worship and false worship. It's what do you consider your summum bonum? Is it the true summum bonum, or is it some false summum bonum? But everyone's got one, right? You wouldn't, Teilhard de Chardin said that, you wouldn't get out of bed in the morning unless you were motivated by some finally unmoved mover of your will. And see, I think that's really worth thinking about. What is it that's motivating even the simplest moral act, like the two of us sitting down and having this conversation? Paul Tillich, the religious philosopher, talked about ultimate concern, right? Everyone has an ultimate concern. You do, everyone does. If you didn't, you wouldn't act in any way. And Tillich always said, and I follow this in my own pastoral life, the most important question to ask about any person is, what does that person worship? Once you know that, you'll know the rest of that person's life pretty well. It'll fall into coherence. What's your ultimate concern? And he defined religion famously as ultimate concern. So in that way, then you've got either true religion, that's Augustine, vera religio, or you just got regular religio. You've got some form of false religion or false worship.
Now, what do you make of people who say that on an atheistic picture of the universe, what we essentially are as human beings are highly evolved mammals that have slowly developed this accidental consciousness to help us to survive. And so the ultimate motivating factor behind all of our behaviors, even if it's subconscious, would be something just as simple as the drive to survive, the drive to reproduce. Because, of course, somebody's not likely to say this. Some people might reference their children, but on the cognitive level, we might reference having some belief in a set of ideals, but we might say that this is essentially a way that the brain tricks itself into being more likely to survive, because by having these invented ideals, it's more likely to do the work that's going to lead us to survive. And so maybe that's the fundamental value. And I wouldn't characterize it as people worshipping their survival. It would be that this is the motivating factor, and what they're actually worshipping is some invented ideal that just helps to prolong their survival.
I know. I've never found that convincing. To me, that's just hopelessly reductionistic. I mean, to take Hamlet and say somehow I can reduce that to the survival instinct, or I can read Plato's Republic and say, well, that's finally all about the survival instinct or the Divine Comedy. To me, it's hopelessly reductionistic. Is something like bodily survival, basic instincts, ingredient probably in everything we do? Yes, I would say, because we have bodies, and the bodies have evolved from lower forms, and they have all of those instincts and impulses. I wouldn't deny that for a minute. I'm not a Platonist in that way. But I do think there's something that transcends the merely animal dimension of our life, and it's revealed in things like Hamlet and things like our ultimate concern and our quest, not just for a particular beautiful thing, but for the source of beauty. And that's that very interesting moment. It's James Joyce in A Portrait of the Artist when he's that famous scene looking out at the woman who would eventually be his wife. And he describes her in this rapturous way. And when she turns to look at him, and then he says, "Oh, heavenly God." And that's the move from Plato through Dante up to James Joyce and many others, that through the particular beautiful thing, I'm triggered into an awareness of the source of beauty, the beauty that I'm seeking implicitly in every particular beautiful thing. Or, when you grasp a mathematical relationship and it's so powerful to you, and the truth of it is not just the evanescent truth of, well, that thing is in front of me right now. It's you've grasped something that's true in any possible world, that's true at any place or time. That triggers an awareness of the source of truth. So that's how I think it works in a religious consciousness. But I go back to Plato with that intuition.
It's interesting how you characterize the position as being reductionist. I share your intuition that something like Hamlet, the idea that the production of it could be reduced to apes trying to survive, seems incredible. But the two things I would say in response to that is, firstly, this is true of all evolutionary biology, and that I might talk about some minute facet of my body, like my eyelashes or something. And the idea that the development of these particular hairs on the end of an eyelid somehow serve in the great survival of species on planet Earth, it seems so absurd and disconnected. But actually, if you draw a long enough chain of reasoning as to why we ended up here, it can be explained in those terms. And also, you said a moment ago that all the behaviors that we participate in are motivated in some way, they're moral in some way, and there's some kind of ultimate motivation. And you said that you would call this God or ground it in God, meaning that, if I choose to read a book, or if I choose to get on a plane or go to the shop to buy some food, ultimately I'm being motivated by this religious structure. And in the same way that you say, it seems absurd that Hamlet can be reduced to evolutionary biology, I might say, well, it seems absurd that me getting up and going to the shop and telling the guy to keep the change is inflatable to something like a religious structure. But I think you would say that, although that seems a little strange upon first hearing, there is a chain there that is ultimately fully explained by religion. In the same way, maybe something like Hamlet and the immense awe that human beings feel upon looking upon their loves or upon understanding the universality of mathematics is rather, depressingly, but perhaps just a very long offshoot of this struggle for survival.
Well, let's play with it for a little bit. I mean, might you trace origins of these ideas back that way? Possibly. But the experience of the idea itself in its full expression, that's where I'm balking to say, well, I'm going to sort of thereby debunk it and say, well, it's really nothing but, now fill in the blank, we're bodies. We come up from the earth, and we come up from these deeper, animal instincts and all that. I don't deny that. But I don't think you believe for a second that when you're entertaining some really high-level mathematics, even though the ultimate origin we could trace even, biologically backward, that in itself it's reducible to a mere concern for survival. That something's opened up there that transcends that dimension. And that, again, that's Plato escaping from the cave, that you've moved to a higher level of consciousness. I just balk at the reductionism because I think it mocks the truth of that experience. So bracket religion for a second, just aesthetic experiences or epistemic experiences or really profound moral experiences. When you see someone like a Maximilian Kolbe, an act of extraordinary saintly heroism in the moral order, and you say, that's explicable in an evolutionary terms. I mean, I just don't buy it. I think something has opened up that mocks that kind of reductionism.
I mean, it's
Explain
a strong intuition.
Kolbe. Maximilian Kolbe, who gave his life in Auschwitz. He was not chosen by the Nazis. They chose 10 people at random to die because someone escaped from the barracks. Kolbe came forward because there was a man that got to his knees and said, I have a wife and children. And so Kolbe came forward and said, I'm a Catholic priest, take me. And so the Nazis happily took him and then starved him to death. So he's one of the great martyr saints of the 20th century. I would submit to you, it's impossible to explain that on simply like evolutionary grounds or some variation of the survival instinct. I mean, I think that mocks the moral splendor of that act. And I think there's something that's concomitant in the epistemic and the aesthetic order too.
I mean, do you think it's truly impossible? I mean, I understand that it's depressing and potentially insulting, as you suggest there with the term mocking, to reduce such an act of heroism to biological drives. But I think that people interested in this line of thought are essentially trying to explain a phenomena. They're saying we have this phenomena of these animals that decide to sacrifice themselves for each other, and somebody comes along and says, well, look, I mean, in the evolution of mankind, people share their genes. You know, if somebody is an adult, they might sacrifice themselves easily for their children on an evolutionary ground. It's so easy to see evolutionarily why it would be that a father would sacrifice himself for his children, especially if the father isn't going to have any more kids. On a purely survival of the genes approach, it's the most straightforward thing in the world to see why that would be the case. Similarly, you can see why it might happen for a brother or a cousin, and you can expand this to strangers who share some genetics in the
see how
human
you're
race.
stretching that's so thin now. I mean, you're beginning with something, as you say, is somewhat credible, intelligible, but now you're stretching it to reach someone like Kolbe, to understand his act of self-sacrifice that way. I just don't buy it. I mean, I get it. I've read the arguments but I just don't think it honors the integrity of what's happening there. You know,
but this is why I wanted to bring this up in this way, is to say that that first step of saying, well, the father sacrifices himself for his son or his children, let's say, and somebody comes along and says, I think this can be explained in terms of the survival of genes. I don't think it would be appropriate to say, well, you're mocking the sacrifice, or you're diminishing the sacrifice, or you're ruining the moral import of that sacrifice. I think all they're doing is explaining it. And so, you know, be it we may be sort of stretching things a bit more thinly, but the terminology that you used of trying to explain such a sacrifice by reference to the survival of genes being first impossible. You say, I think it's just impossible to describe it in these terms. And second, that it mocks the moral sacrifice. If it doesn't do it in the first case, of the father sacrificing himself for the children, why would it do it in the latter?
Because you've stretched that string so tight at that point. I mean, I think you've not honored that a quantum has been crossed. There's something new that's emerged within human experience that can't just be reduced to a physical impulse. It's on a spectrum, obviously, because I would say both visible and invisible, both body and soul, and there's elements that we can explain through recourse to material causality. But then others, I just think a quantum has been crossed. And I always just sort of laugh. That's why I use the Hamlet example, that it just seems so ludicrous to me to say that that's understandable utterly. I mean, maybe in certain respects, or in the beginning of the analysis or something, but that utterly Hamlet's explicable in terms of evolutionary principles strikes me as ludicrous. And the same with high moral acts like the Kolbe Act, or, you know, in any of the three basic orders.
Yeah, I mean, I can see why you think it would be stretching an explanation thin, but I mean, as you say, you're familiar with. I mean, there's a wealth of literature and a wealth of, generally scientists, I think, are of this view. When you hear people talking about reducing morality to evolutionary drives, it's often a scientist rather than a philosopher who's talking about it. But this is a view that's held, and it's a view that's quite popular, certainly among secular scientists and philosophers. I was just surprised to hear you so flatly describe it as impossible.
No, I didn't say impossible. I said the beginnings of the analysis might participate at that level, but I think a quantum is crossed at some point where that becomes ludicrously inadequate as an explanation. So I don't think you believe that. Whenever I talk to people or dialogue with people who are defending that position, I don't honestly think you believe that Hamlet or Maximilian Kolbe or the Sistine ceiling is utterly explicable in terms of evolutionary impulses. I don't think you believe that, because to me that's such a ludicrous position to hold. And it's animated, let's be honest, by a scientism. It's not animated by like pure objective science. It's by the assumption that reality must be reducible to the physical. So I'm going to make this finally ludicrous claim that these very high spiritual and moral values are purely explicable in terms of their evolutionary foundations. I mean, I think it's motivated by a philosophical prejudice much more than objective science.